We have begun in our study of the synthesis of yoga, the chapter titled The Planes of Our Existence, where Sri Aurobindo now goes to the deeper understanding of reality, and in particular the layers or planes, gradations of reality, of which we have had occasion to discuss only in a general way earlier. There is a spiritual consciousness, and then there is our mind bound in the senses, and then there is a transition taking place. But in the transition there are many finer gradations, layers or levels of consciousness in which we can exist, experience the universe, and each has its own distinctive characteristics. In the portion we are now reading, Sri Aurobindo touches upon the deeper ancient knowledge that was present in all countries, searching for these hidden realms of consciousness or planes of being, and the complex disciplines and yogic systems that were developed in all these different traditions around the world at various periods of history. Sri Aurobindo refers to them as various yogic systems and disciplines which had once a great hold everywhere. But the modern mind, being largely dulled into the sensory reality only, looks upon these as something abstract, superstition, or even some kind of an abstract mysticism. Here Sri Aurobindo is going to lay out the framework of that deeper knowledge, the goal of which is for us to be able to not only understand but eventually experience all of these different levels of reality. In the framework which he sets, he chooses to follow the Vedic and Vedantic arrangement, of which we find the great lines in the Upanishads. The Upanishads deal with these with broad strokes, but he also speaks of many specialized systems which have certain common facts, but in the system itself they have differences in both the theoretical and practical arrangements, primarily of prioritizing or neglecting certain things, exaggerating or diminishing values of other things, and so on. In my studies over the years, decades, that I sought to understand these kinds of traditions and their knowledge, I was looking for something which should be common to them all, or find some common principle behind them. And so I want to use this discussion to bring out some of these insights which were developed, which I developed also in my study. But you will see what Sri Aurobindo does is he goes to the heart of it. When I was fortunate enough at a young age, having the temperament of a scientist, I wanted to understand how these things work. What exactly is the science behind the magic? And I was fortunate to have a pretty fat volume which was called Encyclopedia of Occult Sciences. And so I pretty much went through the whole thing, not going necessarily in the details, which I found to be not only superficial and even superfluous, but looking for what would be the underlying principle. You see, as a scientist, you could, or as a technologist, you could apply a technology, even develop a technology, mix this, add that, follow this formula, here's the result. But the scientist asks the question, why is it so? In what way can it be modified? What's the principle behind from which I could derive the whole technology? And so the interest is not so much into what to mix and what the formula is, but what makes for the principle in the formula that makes the formula work. And having got to that, can you actually develop on your own any formula as necessary for your objective? Such would be the approach of the scientist. So looking at all these things, of course there's a lot of detailed thing, cut through it, what is common, what's the common principle. And in each tradition or in each science, whether it is palmistry, astrology, phrenology, symbolism, or the science of omens, handwriting analysis, you can pull a whole lot of things. What is it that makes it this? If you just take something very simple as analysis of handwriting, the way you cross your T, whether the line is above or below, whether it's short or long, whether it goes out or in, whether it's evenly balanced, all of these represent facets of your personality. But is there some way by which you could derive that knowledge rather than reading a whole lot of books and then applying it blindly? Looking at the palm, you're told this is what this means, that is what that means. But if you did not know, is there some way you could derive from first principles the whole knowledge of the palms, the meaning of any lines? Because obviously you see lines in people which are not described in the book that you have referred to. What does it mean then? Is there something you could derive? Or even more interesting when you get into astrology, where things are much more mathematical, can you actually go back to first principles and from there derive all the laws of astrology and thereby develop a whole interpretation which can be so accurate and so on? In fact, Sri Aurobindo himself was a master astrologist. It's not so well known. And we had in our early interviews with some of the old sadhaks before they died, now almost 30 years ago, in our early interviews we had some fascinating stories which we heard. One of them was that Pavitra, a Frenchman who came from very robust technical engineering training from France, with a spiritual seeking, having gone through many Buddhist and other practices, having come to the ashram, he was then surprised at the difference of approach in the practice and brought his technical knowledge into the whole game. One of the aspects of that interest was astrology. And so I've seen in his room a large collection of books, minute detail in astrological methods, analysis and so on. But one of the stories we heard was that he was learning astrology from Sri Aurobindo. And one of the things he would do was to draw a chart and do an analysis. Sri Aurobindo would then make corrections on his analysis and show him what was the right interpretation. And for a while, apparently, for every sadhak who came to the ashram in the 1930s, they would ask for the birth date and he would do a chart and Sri Aurobindo would make observations upon it. And so this was one of the things we heard from the oral tradition, oral history of the early days of the ashram. These things are not written. There was another incident in the ashram school where one of the teachers who was fooling around with palmistry, he looked at the palm of some of his students, and one of the students happened to be mother's great-grandson. So obviously, with the access he had, he went to the mother and said, "Oh, you know, such and such teacher told me this about my palm." And as would be expected, the teacher was summoned by the mother. Okay, I'm making it dramatic. She called him, and then she said to him, "Oh, I hear that you spoke like this to Kalya." And the teacher was afraid that mother would scold him, and mother said, "No, I wanted to explain to you, this is how you interpret it and this is how you have to understand it." So she gave him a little bit of her own training in the palmistry. I'm sharing these to show that this kind of knowledge can be quite spontaneously available to a consciousness that sees into the deeper reality of things. And without having had to study books, one can draw upon that knowledge because there is a science, there are underlying principles that one can draw upon, from which the whole technology of it is almost obvious. Without having read a book, looking at the palm, knowing or directly perceiving those underlying principles, one can pretty much get a sense of what things are like. Or more importantly, the limitations of these sciences. How far does it work? From what point does it fail? Or you take astrology, especially because it is so mathematical, it seems almost precise to the extreme, but how far does it work? What are its limitations? This can be understood not by studying astrology, but by going to those first principles. Sri Aurobindo, in fact, wrote certain articles where he does that, and he reveals to you the underlying principles, as well as in an unpublished text, even he describes how to analyze a horoscope and how do you follow layer by layer the interpretation process. But when you look at the published texts, there he explains that astrology's primary operation is at the level of the vital energies. And it is through the vital machinery of the karmic unfolding that the process operates, or that's the process that it captures. Now once you've understood that, straight away it's obvious what are the limitations of astrology. The moment you shift one step above the vital energy, you are already reasonably free of the astrological influence. To the extent that you rise above it, you become more and more free. To the extent that you are bound in the vital energy, you are bound to or influenced by the astrological process. So just taking a very simple example, if given a situation of life, your reaction or response is instinctive, desire-driven, bound by attachment, or tied to the imprint of the personality of your nature, the astrological influence will be accurate, or the astrological chart will broadly describe the direction of your behavior pattern, because that's what the chart captures. If instead you stand back and observe this whole instinctive movement and say, no, but I wish to choose consciously, not by instinct, not by desire, not by attachment or greed, and I choose consciously by a self-aware mind, to the extent that the center of mind has detached itself from those impulses and acts from the freedom, you have already bypassed the influence of astrology. And if you go further, deeper or higher, from a deeper psychic poise or a higher spiritual consciousness, you are completely free of it. Or at best it acts in the parts of your being which are still bound to the vital rhythms of universal nature and your individual energy flows and their entanglements. So it may still have an influence on the biological process or your life energies, highs and lows, but which also can be modified by the mind intervening. So what this leads to is a recognition that yes, there is a technique, there is a science, there is a knowledge, there is a principle from which you can derive the technology, but this is the narrow band of its operation. The beauty of going to first principles is that you recognize the validity, but also the limitation. And from a spiritual perspective, the limitations of these sciences or technologies are much more important, because spirit is fundamentally free of everything. And if at all these things are to be engaged with, because they're a part of life, they're a part of the universe, we should know our true relationship with them. So Sri Aurobindo here particularly takes the Vedic and Vedantic arrangement, especially he says, because from the very beginning the whole scheme was envisaged from the point of view of the utility of the various planes to the supreme object of our liberation. So this reorientation of priorities, rather than learning a technique to develop powers or engage with powers, you recognize how those are to be utilized in the awakening of consciousness, in the liberation of consciousness. Then the whole objective is quite different and fully aligned to the spiritual. I gave the example of astrology in particular in this context to show you that while yes, these things do work and operate and have a basis, recognizing what can liberate you from these things is far more important, and then from that understanding to exercise that poise of freedom is our objective finally. I have also, over time, looked at various systems, some of which I mentioned last time, the Kabbalah as well as various occult schools, at least to the extent that they put their material in the public domain, but looking at also some of the processes involved in rituals of various traditions. Even their religious rituals have a occult component, including the rituals associated with the Catholic Church. Mother spoke of the occult power that they have, and most of them actually derive from a still earlier tradition and have nothing to do with the teaching of Christ or Christianity itself. But if you look at those rituals, you can see what are the common principles of the different systems across the world. And looking at these, I was always fascinated by the similarity but also the difference. If you take the Kabbalah, for example, and the Tree of Life, it has very distinctly levels, but within the levels there are these split between twos and ones and links between them. And comparing with the Vedic framework of 7 planes, yes, you see the 7 planes, but the Kabbalah is much more detailed, much more bound to structure and design of its Tree of Life. And I was always balancing between these two. Isn't this too simple? What about the details here in the Vedic tradition? And in the Kabbalah tradition, isn't it more interesting to have the specific utility? And the conclusion you come when you read what Sri Aurobindo has to say here is interesting. He says, first, because it seems to me, why he chooses the Vedic and Vedantic. First, because it seems to me at once the simplest and most philosophical. It's the simplest and most philosophical, and this point is important. You have, for those of you who are familiar, the Tree of Life. There is also another which is the Merkaba, which is made like a unit, like a seed unit around which they build a whole philosophy. Or there is the framework, the name I forget, of Gurdjieff, who creates this 9 points in a circle and creates a whole system around it. Many such systems exist. They all seem to work as long as you play with them and within the realm of their power. But interesting part is, after a point you realize beyond this realm they don't work. Or they're too rigid, too narrow, too limited. And this was the point of the whole exercise of this comparison. Can you go back to first principles which are common to them all, setting aside these specializations, these narrowing tendencies which each has developed? And if you do that, you come pretty much to the Vedic framework of 7 planes. There's an interesting statement Einstein makes as regards theories in physics, and he says, simplify as much as you can. Make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. As simple as possible. Meaning you do not lose any more the fundamental principles. If you make it simpler, you're going to lose something. So if you apply this approach to all these different structures with which they describe reality, these designs, drawings, you will find simplifying, you go to the common principles, 1 layer down, 2 layers down, eventually you come to 7 principles. And that's it. Of course, from the 7 you can make it simpler by saying 5, but then you lose the full picture. 7 principles, and out of this you can derive those specialized systems. Show how they work, but also within what limitation they operate. And knowing their limitation, after a point, you would not find it worthwhile to develop and perfect your knowledge of those things. What's the point of becoming an expert at a very tiny corner of the universe when you have access to the broad strokes by which you can explore the full universe? And that's the point where one loses interest in these occult systems of knowledge and rather comes back to these common spiritual foundations through which not only the consciousness is liberated, but through which also it can attain a greater mastery than the occult systems could ever provide. I give you one simple example from the mother's experience here in the ashram. You will recall in the early days of the ashram, while Sri Aurobindo was still living in the building called the guest house, there was an occult attack because they had thrown out the cook's assistant who had been caught stealing. The fellow said he will have his vengeance. He went to a black magician, and a few days down, they found stones falling in the courtyard, and then in the kitchen, and out of the blue stones would appear, and it increased until they could see stones appearing in midair and striking people. They discovered after a while that it was largely around one of the persons who had been, it was around the cook's assistant. I think the cook had been dismissed, and around the cook's assistant it was happening. And the mother saw some markings which were on the wall, some magical symbols which had been marked. And so the fellow was thrown out, and the mother informed Sri Aurobindo. Immediately the whole operation stopped. Well, soon after, as we were told, the wife of the black magician came to Sri Aurobindo, and she asked for forgiveness, saying that the black magician was now in the hospital, he was dying, and because the force he had launched had bounced back. So this is one of the problems in the occult processes. When you release a force, the force has to reach a goal. And if it cannot, well, it comes back to you, because you are the originator of the force. It must come back home in some way if it is not expended. And so he got the brunt of the attack, and Sri Aurobindo laughed and said, "Oh, all for a few stones." And that was it. The fellow got cured and never again bothered. Apparently, in the story, the black magician had said he would not attack Sri Aurobindo. He had already sensed that this was something more than he could manage. And so the attack was located around a few individuals working. But then here's the interesting part. All this is the occult mechanism, whatever was used. Mother then says, I was curious to know what was the means they used. So she put out a summons in the universe, summoning the forces which were used. And immediately, 3 little dwarf-like beings appeared before her. They were mischievous, belonging to a plane of the lower ranges of the vital. She said that they are of a grade where they do not know the difference between good and bad. And so they were just like children fooling around. And so she tells them, well, why do you do this? They said, oh, we were forced to do, because that's the nature of the occult influence on them. And she said, why don't you do something useful? They said, tell us what to do. She said, bring me flowers. And they looked at each other and they said, sorry, we can't do that. She said, what can you do? We can only throw stones. And so mother said, go away. But the interesting part in this whole narrative is all she had to do was put out a call, and they were compelled to appear before her. What did the black magician have to do? He had to go through whatever process, use his machinery, use his technology, and at the end of it, the technology was still too powerful for him to be free of. It hit back because it's like a missile launched. It blew up in his own face. But he needed all that paraphernalia to access certain forces or beings to do something. And all mother had to do was to put out a will and intention, and they were summoned. And she could converse with them and ask them to do something good. Had they been capable of flowers, well, maybe they would have brought her flowers. No paraphernalia, no machinery, no technology. In complete freedom, she could summon or dismiss. And in this, you see the difference between the limitations of occult means and the free possibility of a spiritually awakened consciousness operating its freedom, exercising its freedom, of course in the domain which it can act upon. And so the question really comes down to this: what is the domain of influence of your consciousness? Now, within the consciousness which we have, which is not fully liberated, which is somewhat awake, somewhat self-aware, we have a certain domain of freedom which is somewhat narrow, therefore. As the consciousness awakens and acquires its full freedom, it can also develop the full scope of its exercise of its influence and even eventually its mastery. And what Mother had was a broad mastery which allowed her to simply will and make for things to happen, as did Sri Aurobindo also, including the influence that he put out in directing events in the world affairs. So the goal for us is this. And yet, to be able to get to that, to have a deeper understanding of how exactly our consciousness is to attain to this, we have to understand the underlying principles behind the working of the cosmos. The same principles which in a very narrow focused way are used by the occult technology, but the same principles as a science are available in the broader spiritual method of liberation and mastery. And this is what we are now entering. He has spoken of 7 planes. The 3 lower, which are the 3 principles of our ordinary being, mind, life and matter. The 3 triune spiritual principle of Satchit Ananda, and the link principle between them, the supermind, Vijnana, the free or spiritual intelligence. And so he says, and thus arranges all the large possible poises of our being in a tier of 7 planes. A very interesting phrasing, whose full implication we will get in the next paragraph. He speaks of arranges all the large possible poises of our being. Our being can take many poises, meaning different relationships with reality. And there are small poises, there are large poises. So I can take a poise in which I am a witness. I simply observe as if I am not there, I am not involved, I am just aware of what's happening. Or I can take a poise of a creator, of an activist, engaging with circumstances. That's how you understand poise. The relationship you have with the circumstances. There are narrow poises, where I am now the gardener who is focusing on this one plant and to save it from decline and to help it to grow most healthy. That's my narrow poise and focus, until everything else in the universe is as if lost to me. I have no other function except to engage with this. It's a narrow poise. Or if you have a large poise, what are all the large poises possible? How large can you make the poise without losing the distinctive principles of the universe? And then you come to 7 planes. Within those you can make specializations and build any complex mechanism, geometry, philosophy out of it. But if you go back to the large poises without simplifying more than the simplest, you have the 7 planes, and thus arranges all the large poises of our being in a tier of 7 planes. But first, and this is where we enter now the discussion, but first we must understand what we mean by planes of consciousness, planes of existence. He's using these 2 interchangeably. Plane of consciousness, a grade of awareness in which you are aware of all the things in that grade only, but it's also a plane of existence. You exist in this domain only. So he answers this now, first with a very broad description, and then he will elaborate. We mean a general settled poise or world of relations between Purusha and Prakriti, between the soul and nature. A general settled poise or world of relations between Purusha and Prakriti. So, let's take the example of our own human consciousness, Purusha, poise, observing, and our own physical nature, or our mind, emotions, and physical sensory life as our Prakriti. And what's the relation you have with this and the rest of the universe that you experience through this? A general settled poise or world of relations. A world of relations. I have my relationship, as I said here, as a gardener with the world, which is my world of gardening. with nature in this little garden in which I live. That's my world. And that's the relationship between I, Purusha consciousness, and my world, my nature, both in my thoughts, emotions, actions, and the little bit of world that it plugs into. Somebody else is in the world of philosophy, and he's not concerned with your garden. He's perhaps writing, reading books, or having discussions in a world of thought. His world is of thought and the sense of purpose, meaning of ideas and their interconnections, and that's his world. Is there any intersection between these two worlds? Very little perhaps, but you could still force one. Somebody else is in a world of engineering or design. Somebody else is in the world of transaction, business, interchange. And that is his whole world. He sees everything through that. And occasionally you will have intersections. So let's say you have the world of art, and then you have the world of transactions. And the two can interchange in the world where there's a transactional exchange of art. So a businessman who deals with art, he asks you, he shows you a piece of art. It happened actually to my sister who's an artist. Someone came and said, "What do you think about this?" Oh, she said, "Oh, it's a wonderful piece of art." He said, No, tell me how much I can sell it for. I'm not interested it's wonderful or not. What is the price I can get for it? And she said, "I'm sorry, I cannot. I don't understand the pricing of art. If it's beautiful, it has no price. You cannot put a number to it. The two pieces of art which are so different, each beautiful in its own way, I cannot say this is to be priced more than that or less than that." So in the world of art, price has no meaning. But in the world of transaction, price has the only meaning. Art has no meaning. And you can somehow maybe overlap a little bit in someone who can say, yes, this is more beautiful than that, but that is currently more popular, so I can price it higher. And that kind of understanding requires a different mind. It's an intersectional world which can be his own world. Now the idea here is your consciousness and the play of your nature has a relationship, a world. It can be small, but he uses two words here. General settled poise of relations. Settled because it has to have settled into some persistent form. When I continue this transaction, it has to have consistency and coherence over time and over a spread of space. If in my transactional world suddenly something pops in which does not match the previous, it cannot be a world. If I live in a world where I'm suddenly in the middle of water, now I'm suddenly on a land, now I'm suddenly flying in the air, it's not a settled poise of consciousness. If I'm consistently on land, then it's a settled poise of consciousness. I'm all the time inside the water, maybe in my submarine, that is a consistent, settled poise. Or I'm on the edge of the water washes across my feet, but I'm on land. Settled poise, because it's stable, it's consistent. And the idea here, why he uses this phrase, in fact the soul, or Purusha, can relate to the totality of Prakriti, everything that's possible in the universe at the same time. But if all of it surged upon you chaotically, with no coherence, it would not be the experience of a world. It is when a band of experiences comes upon you, or you relate to a band of experiences which is settled, it is now consistent and it stays stable, that it becomes a world. This point is very important. A general settled poise or world of relations. The relations have become settled enough, and we'll soon see examples of this. For anything that we can call world is and can be nothing else than the working out of a general relation which an universal existence has created or established between itself, or let us say its eternal fact or potentiality, and the powers of its becoming. So there is a universal existence, the relation which it sets between itself, and the powers of its becoming. This is the basic idea. You exist universally. Let's say you are the whole universe as something existing. And then you have the powers of becoming, the powers by which you draw out all the potentialities. What are you drawing out? Eternal fact or potentiality which I am. So, the Brahman as pure existence which is conscious already holds within it all possibilities of everything that it can be. And then there are the powers of its becoming which draw out. I am whale, I am ocean, I am whale inside the ocean. And it sets up a relationship. Whale is inside the ocean, whale is not flying in the air. I am bird and I am air, and I am bird flying in the air. And occasionally it will set up a relationship. I am bird flying in the air that dives in the ocean but comes back to breathe. I am dolphin or whale inside the water that comes up to breathe and then goes back in to swim and live. Or I am fish that never needs to come up to breathe but needs air in the ocean. And these are the relationships that he sets between all of his potentialities, which are becoming, which are drawn out. So, the working out of a general relation which a universal existence has created or established between itself and the powers of becoming. You work them out now. Set up all these relationships. Create a world of these relationships. That is a world or a plane of consciousness. So reread the sentence. Anything that we call world is this and can be nothing else than this. This is a very important idea. World cannot be anything more than this. It is only this. Is that working out of a general relation. You've set up a relationship and now you're working it out. But what is the relation you've set? A universal existence has created or established between itself and the powers of its becoming. And what is itself? The eternal fact or potentiality that it is, and the becoming that it draws out of itself, and the general relationship that it has set, and the working out of that relationship. Now when you think about it, he has created the most abstract, essential definition of a world. We are not yet talking about 7 planes, that will come later. What is a world? So I enter Disney World. What is Disney World? From the moment you enter the gate, within that circumference of that boundary wall, I am in Disney's land, Disney's imagination, Disney's characters. The reality of that Disney world is what? Nobody ever dies. You never see blood. You can get Tom and Jerry fighting and Tom can bash up Jerry's head, flatten him into a pancake, and he will pull himself up and be fine. Nobody ever experiences pain. Nobody is ever unhappy. They're all fooling around aimlessly, meaninglessly, for laughs. Just to have fun. That's it. That's your Disney world. You switch out of Disney world into Shakespeare's world. And now suddenly it's a very different reality. These are rich, complex characters having complex relationships with themselves and then with each other. Sometimes they can take you to extreme sorrow and occasionally punctuating with some laugh. But the laugh is just so that you can find a moment of relief from the extreme conflict or sorrow and get time to breathe so that you can re-enter the complexity of that world. And that is the Shakespearean world. Now you switch to another world, the world of the wizards and magicians of such and such a novel or such and such a writer. And each of these you will find has certain fundamental components which define the world, players out of which the world is formed, and then they're allowed to play out. So the character of world is working out of a general relation which has been set between which holds all the potentiality, and this which unfolds all the potentiality. And between these two, the relationship set. Between those things of potentiality, the relationship set, you let them run and see what are the possibilities that can come out of it. If you have ever watched any long-running TV series which has gone on for years, one very popular one was called Friends. I don't know if you have ever seen it. It's close enough. Okay. Or recently The Big Bang Theory. Let's understand generally then. A few characters are introduced. They are common to every episode. And occasionally there are some odd characters which pop in and pop out. Some others pop in and pop out to bring some diversity. But the characters are broadly set. They cannot change too much. If they change too much, then you would lose the link with that series. It would no more be part of the same series. It would become a new series. You would no more be in that world. So the world is defined by the character of these 5 or 6 players. They hold the storyline, and then you now play out all the possibilities. So now for 1 year, they have this character playing a major role. The next year, that character plays another major role. And so on. They keep moving around, playing with complex interactions. When the possibilities are exhausted, and I'm deliberately taking the example of one of these long-running series, when the possibilities are exhausted, nothing new is coming, people are about to lose interest, you make the characters grow a little bit more mature, a little more complex relations. So first they're all fooling around. Now suddenly one of them gets married and now has a child. The child is never shown in the series because that would change too much. But he has now become more adult, more responsible, or he's still as goofy as before, but the character now learns that his goofiness will not stand, and so slight maturing, and that's about it. That's the world of this TV series. In this way, every novel series has created a world of its own, and this is what it all boils down to. A consciousness and its potentialities drawn out, and the choice is, what are the potentialities drawn out? Disney World draws out these potentialities, Shakespearean world draws out other potentialities. And then these relationships set, you let it run. So now we read the whole sentence, you see how he captures it. We mean, by planes of consciousness, we mean a general settled poise or world of relations between Purusha and Prakriti, between the soul and nature. For anything that we can call world is and can be nothing else than the working out of a general relation which an universal existence has created or established between itself, or let's say its eternal fact or potentiality, and the powers of its becoming. That existence, in its relations with and its experience of the becoming, is what we call soul or Purusha. That thing which is existing, in its relation with its experience of the becoming, is soul or Purusha. Individual soul in the individual, universal soul in the cosmos. The principle and powers of the becoming are what we call nature or Prakriti. So here you have the two distinctions. Everything which is working out, the powers which make them work out, the principles on which those powers operate, that is nature. On the other side, the thing, the existence, in its relation with all this becoming, in its experience of the becoming, that is the soul. So soul determines the relation and enjoys the experience. Prakriti is the nature, is the principles and the powers by which this becoming is playing out. So both have two components. Soul sets the relation. In Disney's world, nobody ever dies, nobody ever suffers. It's decided. Soul has set that as its primary relation. And then it's experience. Soul now experiences. How do we play in this world? Well, we will have to have people struggling, fighting, fooling around. But the goal is to make everyone laugh. It's a fun world. So, in the fighting, always it has to make you laugh. Even if somebody falls, even if someone breaks a neck, it's never really broken. It's always healed immediately. He walks with a stick, he's limping, and he has a spinning head, he seems injured, he has marks over his face, but then he shakes his head and he comes back to normal. Nothing is ever really damaged. And so the enjoyment of that, or the experience of that, is from the poise of the soul. On the other side are the principles and powers which are unfolding. But since being, so this is where we have set world. Now let's look at what this really means. You can have many worlds. Each world is its own universe. Between two worlds, you need not have any intersection. You can create intersections, and each of those could become a world in itself. So when you think about it, pick any experience of consciousness, pick any poise of relationships, pick anything which you feel or think or can imagine, and that thing can be made the power drawn out from the soul, from Purusha, and become an entire universe in itself. Entering in it, you can be so immersed, it is a complete universe with infinite possibilities of play. There is nothing which is too small, nothing which is too big. Each is equivalent in terms of its potentiality of infinite play. Some may have less diversity, some may have more diversity. Yes. Some may have gradations of consciousness which involve more thought, others will have just emotion, or some may have intersections of both, etc. But each is a world, and this is why this universe is so fascinating. In fact, what this means is, from soul and nature being universal, so universal soul and universal nature, all possible relations, all possible powers, in all possible combinations, make for an entire world in itself. Now, going back to our model of 7 planes, we are not yet looking at that, but since we know about it, in our model of 7 planes, on each of those planes, you can have innumerable worlds. So particularly in the physical world, it's more difficult to see, but in the vital world, it's easier to experience the variety. So in the physical world, what is the equivalent? Have you been to such and such country? Have you experienced that particular culture and its values? Well, if you have not, you have missed something great. That's how people will tell you. You've been to Japan, if you've seen how beautifully they have things, the sense of aesthetics. If you look at the whole samurai world, if you have not lived in it among your past lives, you have missed an experience which soul could have had in its journey. And I would like to believe that all of us went through it at some time or other, or something equivalent to it in other cultures. The world of knights in the older period of Europe, the chivalry, the sense of honor, the sense of self-sacrifice, we've all taken birth in that world because of something so rich we could learn from it. And so if you think in these terms, even in our physical world, in our human physical history, on our little planet Earth, we have had so many worlds or phases of development where certain worlds as if manifested on Earth. But those worlds are not bound to that place and location. They live because they are basically relationships of consciousness, of energies, of thoughts and feelings. They live constantly in the Brahman as a world in itself. And so the world of nights even now exists in the vital plane, the plane of those emotions, energies and thoughts. And if you enter in your dream state into that world, where a part of your consciousness goes out of your body, if you enter the world of nights, you will find it is an entire universe in itself. You can have any number of experiences there, but they will all be characterized by those values, those principles or qualities or ideals which characterize or define that world. But in that world of nights, in the vital plane, you could go anywhere. Find all kinds of nights, find variations of the good nights and the bad nights and the confused nights and the nights who are struggling, those who are fighting, those who are in training. Everything is there, unendingly. Now, in a well-made novel, you could capture something of that world. Or if your novel was complex, you'd have elements of the knight's world, elements of the philosopher's world, elements of Disney's foolish world, and make for a complex and rich mix. Because each of these worlds is an entire universe, they also have layers where they can intersect, and that can be your narrower world. Interesting. So when you begin to think like that, you realize every possible relationship that pure consciousness can have with its infinite potential drawn out to a limited extent is a world, and exists right now as an entire world in itself on some gradation of consciousness proper to the principles on which it is based. So if you look at Disney's world, where people cannot be harmed, form cannot break, form is elastic, it is more the play of emotions, likes, dislikes, pulls, pushes, and fun. It is primarily a vital world. And which gradation of vitality primarily dominating? And you can identify, maybe you don't have a name for it, but you can identify in quality of feeling, all Disney products are belonging to that band. And so inside that world, in the vital plane, form is not rigid, it cannot break therefore, it's fluid. So you can actually stretch the arm to reach out and pull it back. When the fellow is scared, his mouth opens, his eyes pop out and pop right back in. Why? Because form is not bound, it is energy expressing form. The energy goes out. Literally, when you are scared, you might have eyes popping, or when you're surprised, eyes popping. But the physical body cannot take it. The vital body can. So you can now recognize which grade of consciousness this belongs to. If you take a completely different theme, the cinema, let's say if you have seen Avatar as a movie, what is the characteristic there? It's not so much about energies, a little bit perhaps, not so much about thoughts, maybe a touch of idealism. It's all about the beauty of nature. Gorgeous nature which is alive, conscious, form which is free and fluid and expressive, and sometimes even extraordinary. And it is in this world that you enter, and you would describe it perhaps an intersection between the physical world and the vital. So somewhere in between the subtle physical or some range of the vital which intersects with physical, the form is the primary focus. But it is made so beautiful. If you read Sri Aurobindo's description of the subtle physical worlds and the sense of glow or perfection that is inside the form, you will recognize, that's the world of the Avatar movie. If you look at Shakespeare, it is much more complex. There is a domain of thought which is very important. The vital elements have often to do with the higher vital, touches of the lower vital, but primarily it is in the range of the higher vital with elements from the higher thought and lower vital, adding to the complex mix. And perhaps occasionally even a suggestion of an ideal pointing to something higher, but that's about it, never touching the higher spiritual. Now when you begin to view like this, every author and the world he creates, you can map it on these gradations of consciousness, sometimes intersections between one or more of these. The reality is that when you free yourself from the physical body and enter in your world of imagination or dream state in your subtle body, you will find these worlds actually exist. In qualitative terms, not necessarily those characters, but in that quality. And because they exist, the writer could capture and articulate them. And if they have formed intersections in their consciousness, it's because intersections exist also in the universe. Because everything is simultaneously present. Nothing is ever totally isolated from anything else. So now we have here a deeper sense of what it means to be a world or to experience a world. Later on, when we will focus upon the gradations, the physical world, the vital world, mental world, we will go into what are the principles which distinguish them, and therefore what are the characteristics they have. You will discover there the key to enter into that world and actually explore those directly. But here we have a base now. Next step. He now goes to what makes this world different from that. We just looked at infinity of worlds, intersections between all of them. What makes this, and that? What makes Disney's world actually this? I described certain characteristics, but they were characteristics of behavior. They were characteristics of emotion or enjoyment or a form. But what makes it distinct from something else? Can you go to first principles of this? And this is the part which is so extraordinary. Like I said last time, you will not find anywhere else in the whole world a text which goes to this essential character of what defines the world. And he will reduce it all to the relationship of three things. And those three things, if you play in different proportions, you can as if create all these worlds. It will be amazing as we go into it. So briefly though, it will be, because you're entering something so essential, at first it will be a little bit abstract, but as we take examples, it will become clear and obvious. But since being, consciousness force, and delight of being are always the three constituent terms of existence, the nature of a world is really determined by the way in which Prakriti is set to deal with these three primary things and the forms which it is allowed to give to them. That's it. That's our key. These three things determine everything, they define the world. Modulate them, your world changes. If you can become conscious of these three within yourself, by modulating your consciousness and relation with these three, you can tune into any world. This is your key. It is something so extraordinary, so powerful, and he will of course now elaborate, but at root it will be this idea. It is so powerful that if this can be understood and this can be mastered, you have got the core scientific principle out of which you can derive all the knowledge and all the technology and all the occult sciences even for access to or engaging with all these worlds. So what is it that are the three constituent terms of all existence? Existence couldn't be if there was not first being, consciousness that is. Second, conscious force of being, the force of that consciousness now exercising itself. And third, delight of being. So, being, which is of course conscious, then force of consciousness of the being, and then delight of the being. Sat, Chit, Ananda. But here the focus is not on the consciousness, but force of consciousness of the being, which is what activates, actualizes, draws out to make for the becoming. So there has to be being, there has to be the becoming, which is the force of consciousness operating. But this force has to operate on something, on being. It takes being to form itself. It takes being to draw out and create appearances of forms of being. And in this whole process, there is the delight of the consciousness in its play, there is the delight of the being in enjoying the play, and there is the delight of the becoming drawn out from the being. Remember, this was part of the discussion we had earlier in the previous chapter. And so he's bringing out that idea once again. So there has to be being, conscious force of being, and delight of being. These are always the three constituent terms of existence. Any existence has to have these three things. So let's look at Disney's world. There is being. You could say in the example of Disney himself as the writer or the creator of this world, he is the God in that world. If he walks into the world of Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse, they basically look to him as his creators. So, what did he do? He experienced the Mickey Mouse-ness of his consciousness. That's the being. And then there is this force of being by which he draws it out, expressing this action which he experiences in himself and objectivizing it. But what is he objectivizing? Himself, his own character of being Mickey Mouse, now seeing himself as Mickey Mouse only. He is much more, but the part of him that is Mickey Mouse is what he has objectified. And in the process there is the delight of being Mickey Mouse, and the delight of drawing out Mickey Mouse and playing all the possibilities which Mickey Mouse could do. And then he looks into himself again and says, yes, I am also Donald Duck. And what is this special feeling or experience that I am? And then the force of consciousness, force of being that draws it out exclusively, and then the delight both of being, of becoming, and the play of Donald Duck. And then into it now the relationship between these two. How do they relate to each other? And what are the elements of the delight of their relationship and all the other elements drawing out from it to build his world? So the world is being which has got drawn out by conscious force of being and is playing itself out for the purpose of the delight of being. And the delight of being is not only in being, but it is also in the delight in the conscious force of being. It is in both. And also in the drawing out of new possibilities. Having played with these, you can see even Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck evolved over time as concepts and as powers of what they could do or be. Suddenly now Mickey Mouse becomes more and more intelligent, and he's applying his intelligence to do more and more complex things. Donald Duck is allowed, in contrast, to remain still a little foolish and impulsive. But the characters evolve, and so there's the growth in the whole exercise. This is what defines this world. You go to Shakespeare, and what you're drawing out in being is much more deep, much more complex. The act of drawing out also is much more complex. The way the characters grow and evolve is much more complex. Their interactions of different types, grades. So the nature of a world is really determined by the way in which Prakriti is set to deal with these three primary things. So in the world of Disney, Prakriti is set to deal with these, the being of Donald Duck, the being of Mickey Mouse, and the consciousness and force of engagement between them and their world, and the joy of their play. These are the things which define it. Shakespeare similarly, these three things in the way that they have been worked out there, that defines his world. Prakriti is set to deal with these three primary things and the forms which it is allowed to give to them. So in the world of Mickey Mouse, these are the forms allowed. Blood is not allowed. Even if Donald Duck finds himself flattened up, almost stretched to an infinite length, he never tears, he never breaks. He snaps right back and is normal. So this is the form allowed. In Shakespeare's world though, people break down. They break up. They die. They suffer. And so the scope of the play is set differently. So how you deal with these three primary things and the forms in which it is allowed to give to them, that defines your world. The power given to nature to deal with these three things and the forms with which she can play with them. This defines your world. Now at this point you've gone to the crux, the core of the three principles which make the world and the relationship set. It's left at a very abstract level. Sri Aurobindo will still work this out a little more, and then he will take the example, what is the physical world like? how do these three things function in the physical world? And then he will describe to you why the physical world is the way it is. Then he will take up how these three things function in the vital world, what makes the vital vital, and what is it that characterizes it, and then the mental. And then he will show you, because it's these three things here which make in this relationship the physical world, in that relationship they become the vital world, in another relationship they become the mental world. By modulating these three things, you can scan across the physical, vital and mental. Or rather, you can even say the physical, vital and mental are interconnected, because it is these three things and their relationship which makes for it being more physical, more vital, or more mental, or less. Now you'll see now the whole of reality is formed by the play and balance of these three things. And so we have to now enter this a little more in depth. For existence itself is and must always be the stuff of its own becoming. Whatever becomes is made out of what? Out of the same existence. It is Walt Disney who becomes Mickey Mouse. It is Walt Disney who becomes Donald Duck, or the house in which they live, or the mice that play around them, or whatever else happens. So the stuff of existence itself is and must always be the stuff of its own becoming. And so necessarily the world is formed by the existence, stuff of existence. It must be shaped into the substance with which force has to deal. It's Walt Disney being shaped into Mickey Mouse by what? His force of consciousness, his force of imagination, or the force now which is put out, his force of imagination, which forms the energy of his world. That works on himself as Mickey Mouse substance and the play of energy of its activity. Force again must be the power which works out that substance and works with it to whatever ends. So what is the force now? The force takes Mickey Mouse, animates it and makes it do this or that. Takes Donald Duck, animates it, makes it do this or that. Within its limitations, within those limitations. And the limitations make for the different characters. But the common feature of the force working in that large band is what makes the world that world. So within him is the substance from which the world is derived. Within him is the force of consciousness which is now wielding the substance. Then force is that which we ordinarily call nature. So the substance comes from him, the force released from him, now working actively, nature, with soul substance, upon which nature works. Again, the end, the object with which the worlds are created, must be worked out by the consciousness inherent in all existence and all force and all their workings. And the object must be the possession of itself and of its delight of existence in the world. So the third component now comes in. What's the object of it all? To possess myself. I am Mickey Mouse. I am Donald Duck. I am this world where all these things can play out and never have hurt, never suffer, never be unhappy, always have fun. And what's the goal of it? The delight. The delight which is being fulfilled in this. The delight of existence in the world. That's what it is moving to. The object must be the possession of itself and of its delight of existence in the world. And as a result of this whole exercise, I possess the delight to be my Disney world and live in it. But where did this delight come? What are the components or aspects of the play of delight? He says, by the consciousness inherent in all the existence and all the force and all the workings. So the object with which the world is created must be worked out in all these three things. And that object is the delight, the possession of the delight, the possession of yourself in that delight. So what are the three things where it has to be worked out? The consciousness inherent in all existence. So not only you will say, in me, as Walt Disney, I have the delight, but I'm not yet in the world until I have the delight in me as Mickey Mouse. I have the delight in me as Donald Duck. In this. And then, in all the force, in their play, when Donald Duck does this, when Mickey Mouse does that, when they fail, when they attempt, in their play there has to be the delight. And in all their working out of circumstances, as they grow through certain events, again there has to be a delight. And what are those events? Where are they coming from? From myself. In my drawing them out, there is the growing delight of new possibilities always coming. So I reread this last sentence. Again, the end, the object with which the worlds are created, must be worked out by the consciousness inherent in all existence, and all the force, and all their workings. And the object must be the possession of itself and of its delight of existence in the world. To that, all the circumstances and aims of any world existence must reduce themselves. Now take any world, any circumstances, any aims, whatever is happening, you'll find they all reduce down to these three things. The substance of existence, the consciousness force which drives, and the delight which is in the consciousness of the substance, the delight which is in the force, the delight which is in the unfolding of events. And all this, all the world reduces down to these three things. To that, all the circumstances and aims of any world existence must reduce themselves. It is existence developing its terms of being, its powers of being, its conscious delight of being. So, what is there? The existence. Let's start with I am Walt Disney as Mickey Mouse. Existence. Developing its terms of being. Terms of being here is Mickey Mouse being drawn out. I am Walt Disney as Donald Duck now being drawn out. The terms of my being drawing out. Power of being to actualize and become this, to become that. And its conscious delight of being. I enjoy this becoming as Mickey Mouse, as this Donald Duck. And so, if these things are there at the base of it, he says, if these are involved, their evolution. If somehow in the whole play, my joy of becoming Mickey Mouse and the play between Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck is not there, is not shown, that means it is latent, it is involved, then it has to grow out, it has to evolve. You do not see it, it doesn't mean it's not there, it just means it is latent. But if it is there latent, then it has to come out. Here the interesting thing now, he is introducing to you first principles of the world's development. Having set the basis for the three things, if any of these three things is missing, or is hidden or dimmed, if it is involved, then it has to evolve. That's how the world will be. If they are veiled, their self-revelation. If it is hiding behind something, well, eventually it has to come out. Very interesting idea. If you look at, from this perspective, any world, let's for the moment stay with these worlds of cinema, television, which have been created. If Mickey Mouse is unhappy, he has to become happy eventually, because the happiness, the enjoyment of it has to come out eventually. Because it was created for that purpose. And so that joy was hidden, now it has to come out. If Tom and Jerry are playing around, the cat and the mouse and the cat, they're playing around, their relationship has been brought out. Somewhere inside is the purpose of the delight. And if that is not seen in the beginning, it has to evolve. If it is hidden, it has to emerge. Now this principle is extremely important because it tells you how a world is going to work out and into what direction. Anything intended which is not revealed in the beginning will get eventually revealed. Anything intended which is involved will get evolved eventually. If you look at it this way, and now step back to a larger picture, from these smaller worlds to larger worlds. Let's take larger worlds as I as a student am now exploring the world of the ocean. Everything that happens inside the ocean is my obsession. I am an oceanographer or an explorer, or whatever form it takes. I enter water. I live in water. I breathe and think only of the things which exist in the water. That's my world. Or somebody else goes into the world of atoms. Someone goes into the world of microbes. Whatever your world is, that is this narrow particular focus of your delight, of your growth, of your fulfillment in the larger universe and in the part of it which is your world. You will find there, if this is something is hidden, it must come out. And the whole unfolding process is part of the joy of your participation in that world. Now you can broaden the scope of the world. My world is everything to do with the earth and the solar system. My world is everything to do with human life and its sense of purpose. My world is everything to do with the evolution of civilizations or humanity, and so on. You could broaden it, but you can still see how whatever he has described here and the three principles which make for the world and their unfoldment is all there. Now let's go back all the way to the entire cosmos within which all these worlds exist. So we use the word cosmos very carefully. Cosmos is different from universe, different from world. World is anything which has this consistent play of relationship between these three things. Universe is the unity of it all. But the unity of it all does not imply necessarily ordered relations. The word cosmos brings the relation of order, of structure across all these things. They are all interrelated in a meaningful way. So now we look at the big picture of the cosmos, and within that we see all these worlds. We find them naturally coalescing in certain bands, which we may call entire planes, in which the relationship between these three things is somewhat similar. That makes for this plane. Change the relationship a little bit, it makes for that plane. Within that plane, many worlds, and so on. And so Sri Aurobindo now focuses on this physical world and the physical plane. Here, the soul lives in a material universe. Of that alone, it is immediately conscious. Now what does it mean? The soul has set up a relationship, remember, with nature, and its relationship is to be conscious only of the material world, this material universe. Of that alone, it is immediately conscious. The realization of its potentialities in that is the problem with which it is concerned. So it's almost as if, let's say, our soul had the option to widen out, experience a band or different gradations in the band and engage with those. But it has chosen this and is concerned only with this. And we'll see later how it gets trapped in this. Once we understand the nature of this world, we will understand the mechanism of entrapment. Once you understand the mechanism of entrapment, you'll understand mechanism of liberation. So everything is moving in that direction. The realization of its potentialities in that is the problem with which it is concerned. But matter means the involution of the conscious delight of existence in self-oblivious force, and in self-dividing, infinitesimally disaggregated form of substance. What's the character which defines the plane of matter? Involution of conscious delight of existence. It's as if the delight aspect has chosen to lose itself and hide inside. Self-oblivious force. Force which is working but has forgotten that it is working. So remember, there are three things. The conscious being, there is force of conscious being, and there is delight of conscious being. Delight has lost itself inside force. Force itself has forgotten its consciousness, and so it's as if hidden inside the being. So, conscious delight of existence is involved in self-oblivious force, force which has forgotten its consciousness. And it has also lost itself in self-dividing, infinitesimally disaggregated form of substance. Substance has taken this form. So last thing, remember, was substance upon which there is force and upon which there is delight. Delight has gone into force. Force has lost itself, lost its consciousness in being, and what's left is the substance, and the substance has taken a relationship of self-dividing. It continues to break up, infinitesimally disaggregated. When it breaks up, it doesn't stop with a piece. You can go on breaking up until it becomes smaller, infinitesimally small, never binds, never coalesces, disaggregated form of substance. This is the substance in which the consciousness is lost, inside which the delight is lost. This is the material universe. Once you recognize this, therefore, the whole principle and effort of a material world must be the evolution of that, of what is involved, and the development of what is undeveloped. Now the logic from what we have seen before is obvious. If this kind of losing of delight and consciousness has taken place, and even substance has lost itself in divided infinitesimal pieces, what has to happen? Whatever is hidden must emerge. This is the logic of the physical world. The whole principle and effort of the material world must be the evolution. Anywhere you go in the physical world, you will find, since the character of things is lost, it has to emerge. Everywhere, therefore, there has to be evolution, and this is the character of the material world. Now, if you created a world where these things were not lost, but they play in a narrow band, there would not be the force of evolution. If they are concealed, they will be revealed. But in this case, they are not just concealed, they are involved. They are as if lost to themselves in a lesser power or a lower grade of power. And then so they have to come out of the lower grade. And therefore, this is the world of evolution. No other plane, as you go higher up the scale, will have this characteristic, because in none of them there is this kind of self-loss. And so we see something quite extraordinary, which he will speak about later. In the entire spectrum of cosmos, evolution as such exists only here, in the lowest rung in the physical world. Precisely because those things are all lost. Delight is gone, force of consciousness is gone, even substance is as if gone, because it's got as if divided into infinitesimally disaggregated. Disaggregated means no joining together, no clumping together. So you cannot see form. Where is form? I don't see it. Empty space is all I see. Where is force? Obviously, if there's no form, where is question of force? Where is delight? There's no force, no consciousness. What delight are you talking about? And so when evolution kickstarts, because it is concealed and these things have to emerge, the first thing that emerges is form, aggregation of disaggregated pieces. It's only when form has sufficiently emerged that you can begin to notice force. And force also now evolves because it was concealed inside form. First you have crude, rudimentary forces, then more and more complex forces. And with it the emergence of consciousness, conscious force. And out of that, gradually the emergence of the delight, which was hidden inside conscious force. But in the beginning, the delight emerging is so crude that it seems to be even its own contrary. And is split into dualities. Now if you see the chain of logic here, the goal is inevitable, precisely because it is concealed. But the play is set by these initial parameters, the principles which have been placed here. The very fact of that concealment makes, by definition, the physical world to be evolutionary. That's why he says the whole principle of the material world must be evolution. And if that is the principle, then the whole effort of the material world must be evolution. Now we suddenly, stunningly, you see, this is what it is. This is the physical world. This is what makes it what it is. And this will become more obvious when we move to the vital world and the mental world. Then you will see the contrast of how different they are. But for now we will enjoy it for what it is. Later when we view the vital, we will again come back and compare in what way the two are different. So therefore, the whole principle and effort of a material world must be the evolution of what is involved and the development of what is undeveloped. Anything which has developed even a little bit, as long as it has a capacity for greater development, it will continue to develop. So there is evolution and there is development. They are different things. In evolution, something emerges which was concealed and couldn't be seen before. In development, the thing which has emerged continues to grow in its capacities. But that's not evolution, that's development. So your intelligence has evolved out of a rudimentary, vital, emotional consciousness. But having evolved, it can now develop into so many different ways. But it will still be intelligence, more or less developed. Out of intelligence, a higher grade will evolve, which will then develop within its own band. Next he says, here everything is shut up from the first in the violent, working, inconscient sleep of material force. Therefore, the whole aim of any material becoming must be the waking up of consciousness out of the inconscient. The whole consummation of a material becoming must be the removal of the veil of matter and the luminous revelation of the entirely self-conscient being to its own imprisoned soul in the becoming. Since man is such an imprisoned soul, this luminous liberation and coming to self-knowledge must be his highest object and the condition of his perfection. So I've read quickly. There are important steps in between and insights which come from each of these steps. But you get the overall drift of what this is. This is inevitable. Now the way he has formulated it, for any material world, this is inevitable. Now let's take the physical universe. Any planet, anywhere there is the material world, you will find this principle operating and inevitably this outcome. Doesn't matter how long it takes, how far it goes, but it will be in this direction. You take any material space in the universe, even in so-called empty space, this has to start happening. In other words, even in so-called empty space, what you have is disaggregated infinitesimal substance. It has to begin to aggregate. It has to begin to emerge. And this is one of the things which is too far ahead of current science, which thinks only of matter as somehow born once in a Big Bang, which is largely influenced by the biblical theories before. The scientists being influenced with that got stuck in that model. But there were equally scientists who thought differently, and those theories are not in your textbooks, but they do think about them, and that is, matter is continuously emerging everywhere in the universe. Not only is it emerging out of empty space, it also has a tendency to lapse back into disaggregation. And there is as if a continuous foaming out from the underlying energy, rising up as foam, becoming complex forms. Equally as complex form decay and decline, it could sink back to rise again. And you have a very different picture of the universe. They speak of it as steady state theory, and all kinds of names may be given, but the concept that there is no place in the physical world where this is not happening is what is suggested straight away by this fundamental insight of the nature of the material universe. Now, having looked at it purely in a physical domain, if in the mind of the creator, whether it is Shakespeare or Walt Disney, if they enter the physical world as part of their creation, these elements will also be true in that world to the extent that it is physical. Or, let's say, to the extent that Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck belong to the vital plane, to the extent that they reach the domain of the physical characteristics of the physical world, these elements of evolution and development will kick in. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you look purely at the Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Tom and Jerry type of cartoons, there is development, there is nominal growth because everything is interconnected. So a little bit of the physical is there, form is there, but there's nominal growth. But if you see later themes of Walt Disney, where there are entire cinematic characters created, movies built on them, not so much the physical printed cartoons, the movies such as Frozen or some other recent movies you will see, where the characters live in a physical world, you will always find evolution, you will always find development. The moment you are bound in a physical form-based world, you will find evolution and development inevitably following. Shakespeare tries to describe a human world. To the extent that he plugs into the physical domain, this is part of his play. You cannot escape it. If you create a purely vital domain, it will not relate sufficiently to the physical. Tom and Jerry was fun when we were children, no more interesting as we outgrow that age. They don't stay with us. At best they are fond memories, but they have no relevance today. If they had been embedded in the physical world, they would evolve and would follow you through in your life, as Shakespeare's characters do. When you first perhaps read some of those things, you will say, what is this problem? The fellow has done a mistake, let him just own up. Why is he messing around with this idea, to be or not to be? But later in life, when you hit that same experience, suddenly that character is next to you. Now I understand that problem. It's a living reality. And just as he struggled through, I am struggling through. It has an evolutionary value. And so sometimes very late in life, you will find yourself resonating with things which you read at that time, and those words will come up. A poem from Wordsworth, I think, where he says, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky." As a kid, you'll say, well, what's the big deal? But when you have the experience, you say, oh wow, this is what he saw, this is what he experienced, and I resonate with it. So the point here is, everywhere that you touch the physical world, you will have this character of evolution and growth, and as a result, it will have lasting value. Anywhere you disengage from the physical world and enter any other bands, purely and exclusively, it is useful while you are in that phase of growth. Once you outgrow it, it has no value. That's why those are called typal worlds. They're stuck in their type, they are not evolutionary worlds. And they help you while you are below that level, they pull you, they support you while you pass through them, but once you cross them, they even pull you back. They become drags. Interesting. You will find in the Vedic description, the Rishi passes through stages of evolution, where first he asks help from a deity, being belonging to a certain plane of consciousness who represents that consciousness, asking for help to grow into that grade of consciousness. Asked for help for that consciousness or that power, that God, deity, being of light, to grow in him so that he has the fulfillment of that plane of development. And then as he outgrows that, he finds himself pulled back, resisted by that presence, that consciousness, that level that says, you cannot go beyond me unless you fulfill these conditions. You must complete this before you can go further, otherwise it pulls you back almost. And so there's a very interesting method in that whole yoga, that you take help and then you outgrow and then you must let go of that which has helped you so that you can go further. But this is characteristic of typal worlds, typal planes. If in any of those you create an intersection with the physical, because any world, any plane can intersect with any other. We will see that later on. Because everything is coexistent with everything else. It's just which one you tune into from the soul consciousness. The Purusha tuning in to the vital experiences vital, tuning into the physical experiences physical, but it can tune in also to both or the intersection of both. And then you will have a vital experience with an evolutionary component. And this is what makes for the rich diversity of this cosmos. And in our human consciousness, all this, remember, applies both on a cosmic level and an individual level. On the cosmic scale, cosmic Purusha unfolding as cosmic nature, cosmic Prakriti, makes for all these worlds, all of them, and infinities of variations of all of them. And our individual Purusha and our individual nature, Prakriti, tunes in to one or more of these. Primarily based in the physical, from within the physical we can tune in a little bit into the vital and mental, because we have vital and mental bodies also into which we have grown. But with that we are able to experience a part or a partial experience of that full spectrum. In our sleep state we can tune in more specifically to the vital or mental, free from the physical. But because we are still bound to the physical in consciousness, we tend to interpret or perceive them through the lens of the physical consciousness. And so all of this we will be discussing later on, and how that clouds the perception or limits it, how we can experience those in themselves, all that will be described later. But result of this is, we have the possibility to experience in a physical body, in a physical world, the character of the vital, mental and spiritual worlds here in an evolutionary framework, because we're in the physical body. When you shed the physical body or withdraw from the physical world and explore those, well, you can grow in them, you can have development, but not evolution. And limited in development to that world. But being in the physical world, you can have the development of all those planes of consciousness in the physical world, because they all intersect here. The result is, the physical world is at the same time both the lowest, because in gradation everything is maximally compressed and involved, but it is also potentially the highest or the greatest, precisely because of the possibility of a complete evolution all the way to the highest, here in the domain of form. We took birth for this experience. Our journey across lives as individual souls is the fulfillment of this experience. And the whole thing is now so simple, so obvious. But we still have to understand the relationships with other worlds and how they intersect with the physical world, all of which will come later. So therefore, the whole principle and effort of a material world must be the evolution of what is involved and the development of what is undeveloped. And now looking at the physical world, because we have seen what is involved. Here, everything is shut up from the first in the violently working, inconscient sleep of material force. We'll understand this more deeply next time. Therefore, the whole aim of any material becoming must be the waking up of consciousness. out of the inconscient. The whole consummation of a material becoming must be the removal of the veil of matter and the luminous revelation of the entirely self-conscient being to its own imprisoned soul in the becoming. This is what we are at as human beings. The full emergence of self-conscious being becoming conscious of his own imprisoned soul. And since man is such an imprisoned soul, this luminous liberation and coming to self-knowledge must be his highest object, because that's the nature of the physical evolution, to reach and complete all the way in the full emergence of that which is involved. So this this luminous liberation and coming to self-knowledge must be his highest object and the condition of his perfection. And this is where we are at. We have to become conscious, first of all, of ourselves in the sense of liberation of consciousness, awakening to itself, and then becoming conscious of our true self and achieving perfection in both of these. This is inevitable for us. Even if we are not conscious of it, this is the prime driver of our existence. Otherwise, we don't survive as human beings. We simply fade out, rebirth, and rebuild in a body which is more supportive to this. As long as you're aligned to this, you can take your body very, very far. When you're out of alignment, well, everything begins to break down because it's not serving this purpose. So you take another body and continue. I am giving an example of a person who was 93 years old when he met the mother. He was a great scholar. And at the age of 93, he tells the mother, I am starting now the translation of the Mahabharata. Now that is the world's largest volume of story. And he says, please bless that I complete this before I die. So he lived to be 107, completed the full translation and then passed on. Why? Because he had set for himself this goal of growth, of fulfillment, and dedicating himself to it. All the energies found their fulfillment in that work he was doing. And the grace, of course, helping, because he asked for that help. This applies to all of us. What is the goal that you dedicate yourself to? Obviously, it has to be consciousness, growth of consciousness, awakening to your true self. But in what form it takes? In his case, it was through that form. But maybe our form may not necessarily be external. Whatever the form, the conscious commitment to our sense of purpose and the help that we ask in this is enough to take us very far, even physically. Everything aligns and supports when you have this sense of purpose, because you're aligned to the deepest sense of purpose of matter or birth in matter itself, the principle of the material world. So this is a very fascinating paragraph which needs some elaboration next time, but we have got to the core principle of the physical world. Later on, he will now describe also the way force works inside the physical world, how life emerges out of it, and so on, the evolutionary stages in the physical world. Having done that, he will then move to the vital world and describe its characteristics, its core principles, and then the mental and the spiritual. So we pause here and we can take up any comments or questions.
It's not really a question, but it's very interesting when you discuss about the substance. This morning I listened, CD of the Mother, 7 March 1964, in Agenda of the Mother, and Mother entered the consciousness of the Mother, entered in the consciousness of the substance of the earth, and she developed.
Wow.
I listen more and more and more. It's difficult to me to explain.
Yes.
It's incredible. Yeah, relation to what you said, what is consciousness
Very interesting.
discover?
Yes. Very.
About the substance
Yes.
of the world.
Yes.
It's very,
Very interesting that you bring this up. It may not be possible for all of us as we are. For us, becoming aware even of our body's substance is a big thing. But it is possible for one who has reached or lives in the cosmic consciousness to identify not just with their own body, but also the larger substantial extension in the physical substance of the physical world. And that was part of the mother's work. And the result was that having entered into that consciousness of matter, not just the human substance of human species and bodies, but the earth's substance of the physical world, infusing into it a higher light and a higher force to assist in the emergence and acceleration of the whole evolution. That can have a massive effect whose results we will see without understanding why it happened. One of the results is that in the physical body itself and in physical matter of the universe, there is a push of the force which is hidden. The force trying to push out, and so an acceleration of the evolutionary process that takes place. In material substance, and you will see as a result even minerals will grow more rich and complex, but in things which are more conscious, like in flowers, you will find a fluorescence of variety and rich possibilities which were not there before, but emerging very quickly. But in the human body, which is most conscious, it will mean also that the body in its evolution speeds up. And all this because the mother plugged into this physical substance, and now we understand how it works. Remember, it was the delight which was hidden inside the consciousness force, which is hidden inside the form, and the form itself has lost hidden. And now in the form which has emerged, with the consciousness which has emerged, at least in the human body, she enters the full physical substance and pushes from there for the emergence of consciousness, force and delight. And so the whole evolution speeds up, at least in the space where she pushes, which at the very least is our physical earth. But we now understand this more deeply because of what we have read. You will notice at the end of the study, our worldview shifts. We're looking at the world differently, we're looking at reality differently, we're looking at ourselves differently. And this shift of perspective is extremely precious. If you can hold this, it is of great value, because from this poise, the whole sense of purpose and the inevitability of our spiritual awakening is there. And everything else of our life, all our activities will organize themselves around this center. We'll continue next Friday.